The sun had set hours ago, and the night had become eerily quiet. A thick fog crept over the small town, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet ahead. It was the kind of night that made even the bravest of souls feel a little uneasy. The only light that shone through the darkness came from the flickering street lamps that lined the deserted streets. The houses were all dark, and it seemed as though everyone had retired for the night. But one house stood out from the rest. The old abandoned mansion at the end of the street loomed in the darkness like a giant monster. The windows were boarded up, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the building looking like a decrepit shell of its former self. Nobody had lived there for years, and most people in the town avoided the place like the plague. But on this particular night, something was different. A small group of teenagers had dared each other to spend the night inside the mansion, and they were determined to follow through with their plan. They had all agreed that it would be a fun way to spend their Friday night, and they were excited to explore the creepy old building. As they approached the front door, one of the girls hesitated. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked nervously. "Don't be a chicken," one of the boys replied, pushing her towards the door. "We'll be fine." The door creaked as they pushed it open, and a musty smell filled their nostrils. They cautiously stepped inside, their flashlights shining into the darkness. The floorboards creaked under their feet, and the sound echoed through the empty halls. As they explored the mansion, they began to notice strange things. Doors would creak open on their own, and footsteps could be heard coming from the empty rooms. They tried to ignore it, chalking it up to their imaginations playing tricks on them. But as the night wore on, things began to get even more frightening. They heard whispering coming from the shadows, and the temperature in the room would suddenly drop, making them shiver. They tried to stick together, but it seemed as though something was pulling them apart. One of the boys disappeared, and they could hear his screams coming from down the hall. They ran towards the sound, but when they arrived, there was no sign of him. The room was empty, and the only thing they could hear was the sound of their own breathing. As they tried to regroup, they heard a low growling sound coming from the shadows. It grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence filled the room, and the only thing they could hear was their own heartbeat. And then, they heard a voice. "Get out!" It was a low, gravelly voice, and it seemed to be coming from all around them. They looked at each other, terror in their eyes, and ran towards the door. But it wouldn't budge. It was as though it had been locked from the outside. They frantically searched the room, looking for a way out, but all the doors were locked, and the windows were boarded up. They were trapped. As they huddled together, trying to figure out what to do next, they heard footsteps coming towards them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer and closer. And then suddenly, the door burst open, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a tall, thin man, dressed in a black suit, with a pale face and dark eyes that seemed to pierce their souls. "Who are you?" one of the teenagers asked, his voice shaking with fear. The man didn't respond, but simply stood there, staring at them with an intensity that made their skin crawl. They tried to back away, but the man seemed to be blocking their escape. Suddenly the man spoke, his voice as cold as ice. "You should not have come here. This is my home, and I do not take kindly to trespassers." The teenagers were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even speak. They could feel the man's cold breath on their faces as he leaned in closer. "But I will give you a chance," the man continued. "You can leave now, and I will forget this ever happened. Or you can stay and face the consequences." The teenagers didn't need to be told twice. They ran towards the door, pushing past the man and scrambling into the night. They didn't stop running until they were back in their own homes, safe and sound. But the experience had left its mark on them. They couldn't forget the feeling of being trapped, the growling sound that seemed to come from nowhere, or the man in the black suit with the dark eyes. Years later, when they were all grown up, they would still talk about that night, and the horrors they had faced in the abandoned mansion. They would never know what had really happened that night, or who the man in the black suit had been. But they knew one thing for sure. They would never go back to that place again.